Since we are fresh from Watches and Wonders 2025, and one of the stars of the show was none other than a real oddity. It got the creative juices in my brain moving around a little bit. And this watch, it's a new model line from Rolex with a name that, well, we will probably never understand. The Land-Dweller is a watch that seems to be a mix of integrated bracelet, sports, and chic, with an aim at being unisex, built for today's up-and-coming urban explorer. I don't know. But what is quite astounding is that 10 years ago, Tudor produced a similar oddity, a Land-Dweller of their own. And the similarities it shares with this new Rolex is pretty amazing. Partly the inspiration for this video is one of the first things I thought when I saw the Land-Dweller was, well, it looks like a Ranger too. And it's fair to say that some liberties were taken, some inspirations might have even originated from this model. But the modern watch that Tudor produced, we know it today as the fan favorite, the modern cult classic, the North Flag. And I've really enjoyed making and preparing videos around cult classics. A few weeks ago I made a video about the Omega Dynamic collection, that entire series. A watch that very much defines the 1990s. This time around we're covering a more modern piece. Something that is a lot more recent, it's highly popular, and we could say it's still sought after. I think what is most interesting about the North Flag, referring back to it now, looking at it in hindsight, through its development, this watch was way ahead of its time. It came out of the gates in 2015 at a point in time where the integrated bracelet fad was gaining momentum. But it dared to be different, very much in line with the ethos of Tudor watches back then. But what also interests me though is that I believe that Tudor both revered and hated this watch over the period of its life. Simply put, because it was one of the first watches to do a few things for the brand. One of the first in-house Hodinkee-based calibers. To this day, it's one of the only recent models that Tudor has produced that has an open caseback. It had a clear and historic heritage inspiration behind it, but also very much wanted to have a modern-looking design associated with it too. Everything from its complication to its asymmetry to the yellow accent colors, these are all things that 10 years down the line, modern Tudor don't think they would be doing at the moment. I think I speak for a lot of us when I say that many brands today, Tudor included, they don't take enough risks with their designs. I'm referring again to the 2025 Watches and Wonders unveilings. Whether these brands are only interested in the bottom line, or a unifying brand identity, maybe all of the above, we can't say that that's not important. But nowadays, 10 years on, Tudor's backbone is almost entirely supported by the Black Bay. Back then, 2012, 2015, they relied on the tagline. There was no clear direction for the brand to go. So we saw quite the explosion of experimentation. Now most of us know the origin of this watch and the relationship it has with many explorer pieces that Tudor makes. The British North Greenland Expedition, or the BNGE of 1952, I'm going to say, was quite a monumental moment for this brand. Prior to 1953, where Rolex supplied watches to Tenzing Norgay, Edmund Hillary, that entire expedition and many others as they tried to climb Everest. The North Greenland Expedition consisted almost entirely of engineers and scientists. They spent over a year in Greenland, experimenting with the geology, looking at the landscape, studying it, creating maps, all the while wearing Tudor oyster princes. The best part of the story is that Tudor wanted the wearers of these watches to record the accuracy and the timekeeping. And they would do it by referring to BBC radio broadcasts and synchronizing their watches every day. These oyster princes were worn by engineers who were working on these tractors as they were bogged down in the snow. Others who were trekking across these landscapes. The end of the story is that these watches were very successful. They performed extremely well, but Tudor as a brand, they didn't take the identity anywhere. It was in fact Rolex who took the Explorer name and moved it forward after the successful Everest summit as more of a tribute watch. But the real watches that took the task to heart were these little oyster princes. Now we know that later on the Ranger and the Ranger 2 arrived as derivatives of the Explorer more than watches that had any kind of unifying identity with their own brand. But in 2015, when the North Flag was unveiled with that great backstory about the North Greenland Expedition, that sort of narrative behind a watch like this was perfect, it kept you engaged. But only 6 years after the watch arrived, the collection was culled and the North Flag name, well, it's yet to resurface. And I think what saddens me the most is that the North Flag name has been almost entirely written out of the brand's current catalogue. They've instead decided to rebrand the Ranger with the same backstory that the North Flag had. Following on with the Explorer 2, we now have the Black Bay Pro, which also fills in the gap. But the North Flag, which I think is a far better name, it's largely forgotten, and I ask why. I guess it all reverts back to brand identity. The Ranger is a far more recognizable product, a lot more like the Explorer. The Black Bay Pro, on the other hand, it's using the recognizable name to drum up more interest in the watch. And if we were to step back now and look at the modern Tudor catalogue, maybe I'm missing a few models, maybe I'm forgetting some here and there, but I believe that the North Flag, to this day, is still one of the most innovative watches that modern Tudor has ever produced since 2012. Simply because it is such an outlier, because it was not only daring, it was a little bit innovative, it aimed at infusing modern and vintage together. It's retro cool, it looks like something out of the 90s. Now we could say it's a watch that now doesn't line up with Tudor's image, but it's also Tudor's fault that that's the case. This watch could have remained, and there could have been so many other collections to stem from it. But unfortunately, between this and the Black Bay, well, the Black Bay name was far more bankable, and that's what won out. And the North Flag is now in the annals of history. Why is it that this watch is still sought after, collectible, still a fan favorite? Well, it's exactly because it goes against the normality that Tudor has adopted at the moment. The same repetitive exercise of creating Black Bays of different colors. Most of us know that this watch pulled its inspiration almost directly from the Tudor Ranger 2. I'm not saying that this was a masterpiece of a watch, the fluted bezel is very out there, but the more bold and expressive Arabic numerals, the dynamic hands, the starkness on the dial, the legibility, and let's not forget the integrated bracelet, which was all the craze in the 70s, somehow it works, and in fact it translates far better into a modern piece than we would think. I just find it amazing that we're in a time now where the Land-Dweller is the sort of watch that's getting attention, and much like how the North Flag was one of Tudor's first integrated watches in the modern scene, it was also one of the first Tudor watches to exhibit a sapphire caseback, so the Land-Dweller is very much the same. What about the stylized Arabic numerals on both of these dials? The stark use of white. Even the inner chapter rings look very similar. And we are left asking ourselves, will the success of a watch like the Land-Dweller spur Tudor on to reintroduce the North Flag soon? Because every single year it's the same thing. We all talk about this watch possibly being revived. And then I think to myself, what would it look like? What could Tudor do to spice this piece up? A thinner case profile, an adjusted diameter, maybe a more aggressive case with sharper facets. The dial on this watch, which I think is very close to perfect, could also see a few changes. No longer having a power reserve on the front, it was very much a novelty that defined this watch when it arrived with the new movement. Instead, maybe a closer relationship to the Ranger 2, with a quarter Arabic 9 on the dial, maybe a Cyclops lens for the date window, and of course a master chronometer certified movement. They could be more creative with the choices of colors, but I think this use of yellow is perfect. And I guess what I'm saying is that on one hand, yes, I see the potential that this watch has, that Tudor could very much introduce it as a Ranger 2, and make a very successful model. On the other hand, though, is it a piece that is worthy of existence next to the Ranger and the Black Bay Pro, which seems to do everything that the original North Flag did? Maybe these two watches are not as daring or as exciting as designs, but one way or another, they do check the boxes of being Explorer-inspired pieces. Dynamism out of the window in favor of checking a box. You know, it's the way it goes. Even if the brand doesn't want to admit it, the North Flag, ironically enough, was the milestone marker. This piece was smack dab in the middle of the crossroads where dynamism, creative ideas, forward thinking also met with a new and modern movement that would propel the brand further forward. The North Flag, it ultimately wasn't a hot seller. It didn't do very well, which is the reason why it's not with us. It leads you to think then, what would have happened if the Black Bay had never taken off the way it did? The brand's design direction could have gone a completely different way, maybe for the better, maybe for the worse. But I would like to think that many of us are still holding on to the idea that the North Flag is going to return in one way or another, possibly under the guise of the Ranger 2. Because with a piece like this and the technology that the brand now has after years of development and refinement, they are sitting on a goldmine to release their own variant in tandem, a 70s-inspired integrated bracelet sports watch. Now with everything at their disposal, it could be an amazing comeback story. So what is it about the North Flag that made it such a delayed success? A watch that was produced ahead of its time, maybe at a wrong time, but one that nonetheless remains relevant, I think now more than ever. Thank you for taking the time to watch this video. See you in the next one.